Hello everyone and welcome back to Trail of Secrets. I know many of you use these videos to unwind or even fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story number 1. It was a quiet evening when I stopped by the convenience store near my apartment. The streetlights flickered intermittently, their glow casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. A faint breeze rustled the trees lining the sidewalk, their skeletal branches swaying gently as if whispering secrets to one another. The rhythmic hum of distant traffic was the only sound breaking the eerie stillness of the night. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself as I approached the store's glass doors. A neon open sign buzzed in the window, its red and blue hues reflecting off the glass like a ghostly beacon. The moment I stepped inside, the door chime rang, a sharp, artificial ding that echoed unnaturally in the empty space. The store was nearly deserted. Aisles of neatly stacked shelves stood like silent sentinels, each row meticulously arranged yet somehow forlorn in their sterile uniformity. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that gave everything a slightly washed-out appearance. I could smell the mingling scents of industrial-strength cleaning supplies and the faint, musty aroma of old receipts tucked away in forgotten corners. I exhaled slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the artificial brightness. The only other person in the store was a middle-aged cashier behind the counter, his face partially hidden behind the glow of the register screen. His posture was slouched, his movements slow, as if weighed down by unseen burdens. He barely acknowledged my presence, his tired eyes flicking toward me before returning to the register. As I moved deeper into the store, my footsteps echoed lightly against the white-tiled floor. I walked past shelves stocked with canned goods, their metallic surfaces glinting dully under the overhead lights. The refrigerated section hummed steadily, condensation fogging up the glass doors. A flickering bulb above the snack aisle pulsed erratically, casting momentary shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I reached for a bottle of water, my fingers brushing against the cool plastic. Just as I pulled it from the shelf, a soft rustling sound reached my ears. I turned my head sharply, scanning the store. There was no one there, just rows of still inanimate products staring blankly back at me. Shaking off the unease creeping up my spine, I made my way to the counter. The cashier's eyes met mine as he reached for the barcode scanner. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up my bottle of water, the scanner's red light flickering over the plastic. And then he hesitated. His gaze lifted, locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. His expression was unreadable, his lips slightly parted as if he were about to say something. A moment stretched between us, thick with an unspoken tension. "You should be careful," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran through me. The way he said it, low, urgent, made my stomach tighten. I forced a small, nervous laugh. "Careful of what?" I asked, hoping for a mundane explanation, something that would break the strange tension hanging in the air. But he didn't answer. Instead, his gaze darted toward the store's front entrance, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter tightly. He swallowed hard, as if weighing his words, then quickly finished scanning my items. I paid in silence, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe he was just tired, maybe he was messing with me. Maybe the door chime rang again. My head snapped toward the entrance. The door had swung open slightly, just enough for the night air to slip inside. The cold breeze carried a faint scent, something earthy, metallic. I didn't see anyone. The cashier's face paled. His fingers hovered near the register buttons, as if debating whether to close the till and walk away. "Just be careful," he repeated, his voice even lower this time. I grabbed my bag, nodding stiffly, and turned to leave. My nerves buzzed with an unfamiliar tension as I stepped through the door and back onto the dimly lit sidewalk. The store's fluorescent glow faded behind me, swallowed by the night. I wasn't sure why, but something felt wrong. The sensation clung to me as I walked toward my car, my steps quickening without my conscious effort. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors instinctively before I even started the engine. I exhaled, shaking my head at my own paranoia. Then I glanced at my rearview mirror. A car sat parked across the street. Its headlights were off, but I could just make out the dark silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. The figure was motionless, watching. My pulse quickened. I turned the key in the ignition, the car humming to life beneath my fingertips. The other vehicle remained still, shrouded in shadow. I pulled out onto the street, keeping my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror as I turned the corner. The car behind me did the same. A cold realization settled over me. I wasn't imagining things. They were following me. I kept my breathing steady, my mind racing through options. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. Maybe I made another turn. So did they. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. The streets were nearly empty, the occasional streetlight casting pools of dull orange across the asphalt. My apartment wasn't far, but dread pooled in my stomach at the thought of leading whoever this was straight to my home. I took an unexpected left, veering toward a busier main road. The car hesitated, then followed a few seconds later. The gap between us widened slightly, but they were still there, watching. I pulled into a gas station, parking near the brightly lit pumps. The other car slowed but didn't stop, cruising past the station before disappearing around the corner. I waited, gripping the steering wheel tightly, counting the seconds. Nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the cashier's warning had gotten under my skin more than I thought. Or maybe a sudden knock on my window made me jump. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned my head. A man stood outside my car. I didn't recognize him, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and hollow in the artificial light. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lock button, and then, without a word, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the night. I didn't go home right away. I sat in my car for a long time, the cashier's words echoing in my mind. You should be careful. I still didn't know what he meant, but I was beginning to understand. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave me a strange warning. His face was lined with the weight of years spent under fluorescent lights, scanning barcodes, handling cash, and existing in a space where time seemed to move in loops. His name tag, worn and slightly tilted on his blue uniform, read, Mark. The store was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerators lining the back wall. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, wrapping the streets in an eerie quiet. I placed my items on the counter, a bottle of water, a pack of gum, and a bag of chips. Mark moved with mechanical efficiency. The scanner beeped in rhythm, one after the other. Beep, 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 and then silence. His hand hovered over the last item, a simple candy bar. He didn't scan it. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly, and he exhaled as if weighing his words carefully. His eyes lifted, meeting mine. They weren't just tired, they were searching, almost pleading. You should be careful, he whispered, his voice so low I almost thought I imagined it. A chill ran down my spine. The way he said it, the way his fingers clenched around the candy bar sent a ripple of unease through me. His tone wasn't casual, wasn't the kind of warning someone gives when there's ice on the sidewalk or a storm rolling in. It was deeper than that. Urgent, almost desperate. I forced a nervous chuckle, trying to shake off the feeling. Careful of what? I asked, half expecting him to tell me something mundane. Maybe a local mugger, a bad batch of snacks, or some weird store. Policy I wasn't aware of, but Mark didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered toward the glass doors of the store, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he swallowed. The fluorescent lights above cast a hollow glow over his face, emphasizing the shadows beneath his eyes. It's just He hesitated, then shook his head. Strange things happen late at night. I glanced behind me instinctively, scanning the aisles. There was no one else in the store. The only movement came from the flickering light above the freezer section, buzzing softly, like an insect trapped between walls. My skin prickled, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I turned back to him. Strange things, I echoed, gripping the counter slightly. What do you mean? Mark let out a slow breath and finally released the candy bar, placing it gently atop the other items. He punched a few buttons on the register, but his hands were slower now, deliberate as if stalling. People see things, he murmured. Things that shouldn't be there. My throat went dry. Like what? His gaze lifted again, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw something flicker in his pupils. Fear, maybe, or something darker. He shook his head. You'll know if it happens to you. The register beeped, breaking the thick silence between us. I blinked, suddenly, aware of how hard my heart was beating. This was ridiculous. It was just a cashier in a nearly empty store. Just a random tired guy making conversation, right? I pulled out my wallet, sliding a few bills across the counter. Mark took them, but as he handed me my change, his fingers brushed against mine, and I felt it. His hand was ice cold. Not the kind of cold from handling refrigerated goods, but a deeper, unnatural chill, like he had been standing outside in the dead of winter for hours. I pulled back instinctively, gripping the coins in my palm. He noticed my reaction, but said nothing. Instead, he finally broke eye contact and placed my receipt in the bag. I hesitated before picking it up. Mark, I said, trying to read his face, to see if this was some elaborate joke, some half-hearted attempt at scaring the late-night customers. Are you messing with me? For the first time he smiled, but there was no humor in it. Only something sad, something knowing. I hope I am, he said softly. For your sake. A shiver ran down my spine. I grabbed the bag, nodding slightly, and turned toward the exit. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and a gust of cold air greeted me. I stepped outside, the crisp night wrapping around me like a second skin. As I walked to my car, I glanced back through the store's glass windows. Mark was still there, standing behind the counter, watching me. But there was something off. His posture had changed, rigid now. His expression unreadable. Frowned, slowing my steps. Something about the way he stood. And then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. A figure stood just outside the range of the store's light, barely visible in the darkness beyond the parking lot. It was motionless, its outline blurred at the edges, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, scanning the lot. Empty. Nothing but the distant sound of a car engine from the main road. I looked back at the window. The figure was gone. Mark was still watching me, his expression unreadable. I didn't wait to process what had just happened. I climbed into my car, locking the doors immediately. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, the unease settling deeper in my gut. When I finally managed to start the engine, I cast one last glance at the convenience store. Mark had turned away now, back to his routine, back to scanning invisible customers in an empty store. I pulled out of the parking lot quickly, my heart pounding against my ribs. The street ahead was dark, the streetlights flickering as if protesting their own existence. I drove in silence, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Mark's words replayed in my mind over and over. You should be careful. I told myself it was nothing, just a tired man with a strange way of speaking, just a trick of the light in the store's window, just my imagination playing games on me after a long day. And yet, as I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, something was watching, waiting, and whatever it was, it knew I had seen it. A chill ran down my spine. The cashier's words lingered in my mind, their weight far heavier than they should have been. Careful of what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't answer. His tired eyes, now wide with something that resembled fear, flicked toward the entrance before returning to the register. He pressed his lips together as if he had already said too much. The beep of the scanner as he resumed his work felt unnatural, mechanical, like it belonged to another world. The moment had passed, but the unease stayed with me. I swallowed, suddenly eager to leave. I grabbed my bag and forced a smile, but the cashier didn't return it. Instead, he merely nodded. The slightest, most imperceptible movement before I turned away. As I stepped outside, the cold night air wrapped around me, sharp and biting. The store's fluorescent lights cast a dull glow over the mostly empty parking lot. A single car sat a few rows away, a dark-colored sedan with tinted windows. I wouldn't have noticed it if not for the way it sat perfectly still, its engine off, as though it had been parked there for a long time. Something about it made me pause. Had it been there when I arrived? I shook my head. I was being paranoid. The cashier's cryptic warning had gotten under my skin, and now I was seeing threats where there were none. I walked briskly to my car, my keys already in hand. As I unlocked the door, I cast one last glance at the sedan. Nothing, no movement, no sign of life inside. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The soft hum of the car was comforting, drowning out the unease clinging to me. I took a deep breath and pulled out of the parking lot. The roads were mostly empty, just the occasional passing car or lone pedestrian making their way home. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it, the dark sedan. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. A car leaving at the same time as me wasn't unusual. But as I drove through the quiet streets, taking my usual turns toward my apartment, the sedan remained. Not too close, not too far, just a constant presence, a shadow in the dark. My heartbeat quickened. I tested the theory by taking an unexpected left turn. The sedan followed. Another turn. It was still there. A lump formed in my throat. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. The cashier's warning played on a loop in my head, and suddenly the night didn't feel so cold anymore. It felt suffocating, like the air had thickened, pressing down on me. I reached a red light. My fingers tapped the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, willing the light to change faster. In my mirror, the sedan remained at a distance, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Think, stay calm. I could turn toward the police station. But if I was wrong, if this was just some random driver, I'd look ridiculous. The light turned green. Instead of continuing home, I made an abrupt right turn onto a road I never took. It led toward a more populated area, lined with late-night diners and gas stations. If the car followed now, there would be no doubt. I counted the seconds, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. 1, 2, 3. The sedan turned right. My breath hitched. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone was following me. I pressed my foot against the accelerator, not enough to speed, but enough to put some distance between us. The neon lights of a 24-hour diner came into view. I made a split-second decision and swerved into the parking lot, pulling into a space near the entrance. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched the road. The sedan slowed. For a moment, I thought it might keep going, but then it pulled into the lot. I felt sick. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, ready to call for help. But before I could dial, the driver's side door of the sedan opened. A tall figure stepped out, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't make out their face in the dim lighting, but they hesitated, standing just outside their car as if debating their next move. The diner's door swung open, and a group of people exited, laughing as they made their way to their cars. The figure turned, almost as if startled, before quickly getting back into the sedan. A second later, the engine roared to life and the car backed out of the lot, disappearing into the night. I sat frozen, my breath shaky. Who were they? What did they want? And why had the cashier warned me? One thing was certain, I wasn't going home just yet. I needed answers. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls like an unseen force, thick and suffocating. The hum of the city had faded into the distance, leaving only the faint rustle of the trees outside my window. I had been lying in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had followed me home from the convenience store. Then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of a breeze against dry leaves. But as I strained to listen, it became unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel just beyond my bedroom window. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I considered the possibility that I was imagining it, that my paranoia had finally gotten the best of me. But then there was another step. Closer this time. My pulse quickened, pounding against my ribcage like a drum. I turned my head toward the window, my heart hammering as I slid out from under the covers. The dim glow of the streetlight outside cast long shadows across the room, stretching the darkness like grasping fingers. I hesitated for a second, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I had to look. Swallowing my fear, I crept toward the window, my bare feet soundless against the wooden floor. The curtains were slightly parted just enough for me to peer outside without being seen. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and looked. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the reach of the streetlight. My stomach twisted into knots. The figure was tall, motionless, watching, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there. The dim light barely illuminated their features, but I could make out the outline of broad shoulders, the dark clothing blending into the night like ink bleeding into paper. I fought the instinct to pull back. If they knew I was watching, would they come closer? Would they try to get inside? My hand trembled as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I had to call someone, the police, a neighbor, anyone. But just as my fingers wrapped around the device, the figure shifted, a single step forward. I sucked in a breath, my entire body locking in place. They were moving. Another step. The glow of the streetlight caught the edge of their face, just a sliver, just enough to see the glint of eyes staring directly at my window. They knew I was there. I stumbled backward, my pulse erratic. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me. My hands were clammy, my breath uneven. What do I do? The door. My bedroom door. I could run to the front door, get out, go to a neighbor's house. But what if they were already outside the house, circling the perimeter, waiting for me to step out? I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to think. I had to be rational. I had to stay in control. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on. Light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. And then, the footsteps started again. Faster. My stomach clenched as I realized what was happening. The figure was moving toward my front door. Panic surged through me like wildfire. I bolted toward the bedroom door, throwing it open just as I heard the unmistakable creak of the porch steps outside. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move, sprinting down the hallway toward the living room. My phone was still clutched in my hand, but I hadn't dialed yet. I had seconds before they tried to get inside. I reached the front door and pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. Then, a soft, deliberate knock. My heart nearly stopped. Who knocks at this hour? Who just stands outside someone's house in the middle of the night? I clutched my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. But then something strange happened. The knocking stopped. No footsteps retreating, no rustling outside, just dead silence. I hesitated. Had they left? Slowly, I crept to the window near the door and peeked through the blinds. The street was empty. The figure was gone. A wave of relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived, because when I turned back toward the door, I saw it. A slip of paper pushed through the gap at the bottom. My hands shook as I bent down to pick it up. The paper was crumpled, as if it had been clenched tightly in someone's fist. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the message scribbled in messy, uneven handwriting. You were warned. The breath rushed out of me in a single, panicked exhale. My fingers tightened around the note. The cashier. His warning at the convenience store echoed in my mind. He knew. He had tried to tell me. But tell me what? I stepped back, my eyes darting around the dimly lit room. Was I still being watched? Was he still out there waiting for me to let my guard down? One thing was clear. I wasn't safe. And whatever was happening, whatever I had stumbled into, it wasn't over, yet not even close. The next morning I woke up with an unsettling heaviness in my chest. Sleep had been elusive, broken by dreams that felt too real, whispers in the dark, a shadow slipping just out of view, the echo of footsteps where there should have been none. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples as I tried to piece together the events of the previous night. The fear, the paranoia, the figure outside my window. It all seemed like a dream now, something my mind had exaggerated in the fog of sleep deprivation. But the warning, that had been real. The cashier, his tired eyes, the way his voice had dropped to that near whisper like he was afraid someone else might hear him. You should be careful. Why? What had he meant? The more I thought about it, the more urgent the need became. I had to go back to the store. I needed answers. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had just been overly tired, and my mind had played tricks on me. But a part of me, the part still haunted by the eerie events of the night before, wasn't so sure. I dressed quickly, throwing on a jacket even though the morning sun was already warming the air. The streets were alive with the usual city hum, cars, honking, people talking, the occasional bark of a dog. It was comforting in a way, a stark contrast to the eeriness of the previous night. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the world around me wasn't as normal as it seemed. The convenience store came into view, looking just as it always had. The glass doors gleamed in the sunlight, a few customers moving in and out, oblivious to my racing thoughts. I stepped inside, my pulse quickening. The smell of cleaning supplies and stale receipts was the same. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their artificial glow casting strange shadows on the floor. I scanned the store looking for him, the cashier from last night. But he wasn't there. Instead, a young woman stood behind the counter, chewing gum and scrolling through her phone. I hesitated before approaching, my heart hammering. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out hoarse. Is the guy from last night here? Middle-aged, dark hair? Kind of tired looking?" She blinked at me, then frowned. "What guy?" "The cashier. He was working last night." She gave me a blank stare. "I was on shift last night." I felt my stomach drop. "No, that's not right. It was a man. He warned me about something." The girl smirked, shaking her head. "You must have been at the wrong store. We don't have any guys working nights." "No, I was here," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "I remember the shelves, the smell, the lights. I remember him." He looked right at me. Her expression shifted, the smirk fading. "Sir, we close at 10. There's no night shift." A cold chill ran through me. "No, that's not right," I murmured, stepping back. My hands trembled. I was here. I spoke to him. The girl watched me warily as if I were losing my mind. Maybe I was. My breath came in shallow bursts, my thoughts racing. If she was telling the truth, if this store really did close at 10, then who had I spoken to? I turned, stumbling out of the store, the bright sunlight feeling foreign on my skin. My heart pounded in my ears. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. I had seen him. I had heard him. He had warned me. And yet, he had never been there at all. What do you think really happened? Was it just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, or was there something far more sinister at play? The warning, the shadow outside my window, the mysterious disappearance of the cashier. None of it makes sense. Could he have been a ghost, a lingering presence tied to something tragic in that store? Or maybe he was trying to protect me from something I still don't understand. And what about the car that followed me? Was it connected, or just a coincidence? The unanswered questions haunt me, looping in my mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. The more I think about it, the more the lines between reality and imagination blur. Was I truly alone that night? Or is someone, or something, still watching? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Story number 2. It was a quiet evening when I stopped by the convenience store near my apartment. The air outside was thick with the lingering heat of the day, but the sky had cooled to a dusky blue, speckled with the first hints of stars. The street was nearly deserted, only the occasional flicker of passing headlights breaking the stillness. The neon sign above the store hummed softly, casting an artificial glow over the pavement. Its buzzing a faint accompaniment to the distant sound of a siren wailing somewhere in the city. As I pushed open the glass door, a small bell jingled overhead, announcing my arrival. The store was nearly empty, the kind of stillness that made every small noise seem amplified. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly, buzzing in a rhythmic pattern that blended with the gentle hum of the refrigeration units lining the back wall. The cool air hit me immediately, bringing with it a faint scent of cleaning supplies and old receipts, mingling with the lingering aroma of stale coffee from the self-serve station near the register. My footsteps echoed against the scuffed tile floor as I made my way toward the aisles. The shelves were lined with an odd assortment of products, some neatly arranged, others slightly askew, as if handled absent-mindedly by previous customers who had thought better of their choices. A row of candy bars sat half-stocked, their wrappers crinkled under the fluorescent light, while a stack of energy drinks stood precariously on a nearby display. The faint rustling of plastic as the air conditioning unit kicked in sent a subtle shiver through me, though I told myself it was just the temperature shift. As I moved deeper into the store, I became increasingly aware of just how empty it was. There was no low murmur of other shoppers, no quiet conversation between employees, just the occasional beeping of the register and the faint scrape of a broom against the floor from somewhere behind the counter. It felt strangely hollow, as though I had stepped into a place abandoned by time, existing in a pocket of stillness where the outside world ceased to matter. I reached for a bottle of water, my fingers brushing against the chilled condensation as I pulled it from the shelf. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, each inhale and exhale syncing with the rhythmic buzzing of the lights. A faint creak came from somewhere near the back of the store, and I froze, for a moment my heart giving a slight jolt. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself. Old structures had a way of speaking in whispers when left undisturbed. Shaking off the unease, I moved toward the front, glancing briefly at the security camera feed displayed on a small monitor near the register. The grainy black and white image flickered slightly, showing the empty aisles and the dimly lit entrance. The screen distorted for a brief second before returning to normal, and I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a scruffy beard, stood behind the counter, his hands idly tapping against the glass surface as he waited. His gaze lifted as I approached, and there was something unreadable in his expression. Something that made my skin prickle with an unspoken tension. "Late night?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, barely more than a murmur. "Yeah," I replied, setting my items down. "Just grabbing a few things before heading home." He nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the bottle of water. First, the beep of the register sharp in the quiet. The air between us felt weighted, as though he was hesitating to say something. I watched as his fingers hovered over the next item, a bag of chips, but he didn't scan it right away. Instead, he exhaled, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You should be careful," he whispered suddenly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the lights. A chill ran through me. "Careful of what?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. For a long moment, he didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the glass door, as if expecting someone to be standing there watching. When he turned back to me, his face was shadowed with something that looked a lot like fear. "Just be careful," he repeated, softer this time. The register beeped again as he finished scanning the rest of my items, but I barely heard it. My heart was pounding slightly, a nervous energy creeping into my chest. I wanted to press him for more, to ask him what exactly he meant, but the weight of his stare made my words stick in my throat. I paid for my things, my hands feeling oddly cold despite the warmth of the store. As I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The glass door swung shut behind me with a soft click, sealing me back into the quiet night. The street was still empty, the neon signs glow painting long shadows across the pavement. As I walked to my car, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, my pulse quickening as I glanced around. The street was deserted. No one stood beneath the flickering streetlights. No movement came from the darkened alleyways. Yet, the feeling lingered, wrapping around me like an unseen presence. Sliding into the driver's seat, I locked the doors with a quick press of the button, my breath steady but my nerves on edge. I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit, expecting to see nothing but the empty lot behind me. Instead, a car sat parked a few spaces back, its headlights off, its dark silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. I swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel as a slow, creeping dread settled into my bones. I wasn't alone, and something told me that whatever the cashier had been trying to warn me about, it had already begun. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave me a strange warning. As he scanned my items, his movements were slow and deliberate, his fingers pausing briefly over each barcode. There was something almost hesitant about the way he handled my things, as if his mind was elsewhere. I barely paid attention at first, too preoccupied with the nagging feeling that had followed me from the parking lot. That lingering sense of unease still clung to me like an unseen presence, making the fluorescent lights above feel too bright, the quiet hum of the store too unnatural. Then, mid-scan, the cashier froze. His fingers tightened around the bag of chips he had been about to ring up, knuckles going slightly pale from the pressure. Slowly, his gaze lifted to meet mine. His eyes, dark and shadowed with exhaustion, held something else now, something deep, something unsettled. For a moment, he simply stared, his expression unreadable. My stomach tensed at the intensity of it. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You should be careful." The words were so soft, so unexpectedly urgent, that they sent a chill creeping up my spine. I blinked, taken aback. My first instinct was to brush it off as some strange joke, but there was nothing remotely humorous in his face. The seriousness of his tone, the way his hands slightly trembled as he finally set the bag down, told me that whatever this was, it wasn't casual. Something about the way he said it, like it was more than just a general warning, like he meant it specifically for me, made my pulse pick up. I forced a weak chuckle. Careful of what? For a second I thought he was going to answer. His lips parted slightly, his eyes darting briefly toward the entrance as if checking to see if we were alone. The store was still empty. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably, thick with something unspoken. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had risen, he shook his head. "Never mind," he muttered, dropping his gaze back to the register. His fingers moved mechanically, scanning the rest of my items without another word. It was like a switch had flipped, like whatever had prompted that moment had passed, and now he was just another tired worker finishing his shift. But the unease didn't pass for me. I watched him closely, searching his face for some clue, some indication of what that had been about. His expression remained neutral, his focus on the transaction, but I could still see the stiffness in his posture, the way his shoulders seemed rigid with some hidden strain. I hesitated. The rational part of me wanted to let it go. Maybe he was just messing with me, or maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. But the other part, the part that still felt that prickling sense of being watched, the part that couldn't shake the cashier's too intense stare, wasn't convinced. "Hey," I tried again, my voice lower this time. "Is something wrong? Did you—" 1287, he interrupted, cutting me off without looking up. I frowned. He was shutting me out. Whatever had spooked him, he wasn't going to elaborate. Still, my fingers trembled slightly as I pulled out my wallet, fumbling with the cash before handing it over. As he counted out the change, I could see the tension in his fingers, the way his hands shook just slightly. When he finally pushed the bills into my palm, our fingers brushed briefly, and I realized his skin was cold. "Have a good night," he said, but the words sounded forced, like they weren't meant for me, like they were just something he was required to say. I swallowed hard, grabbing my bag. "Yeah, you too." As I turned to leave, I couldn't resist glancing back one last time. He was still watching me, but this time there was something else in his expression. Something almost mournful, like he already knew something I didn't. I stepped outside into the night, the automatic doors hissing shut behind me, sealing me back into the uneasy quiet of the parking lot. The air was crisp, cooler than before, and as I took a deep breath, I tried to shake off the lingering weight of that encounter. But something inside me whispered that I wouldn't be able to. Chill ran down my spine. The cashier's words still echoed in my mind as I stepped out of the store, my bag of groceries swinging slightly in my grip. The night air was sharp and still, a stark contrast to the artificial hum of the convenience store. "Careful of what?" I had asked. But he hadn't answered. He had simply looked at me, his tired eyes dark with something unreadable, something that left me feeling uneasy. As I walked across the near-empty parking lot, the store's fluorescent lights cast elongated shadows on the asphalt. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and damp pavement, the remnants of a brief rain shower from earlier in the evening still clinging to the ground. My car was parked under one of the few functioning streetlights, its dull glow barely enough to push back the deepening darkness. I told myself to shake it off. Maybe the guy had just been messing with me. Maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But as I reached my car and unlocked the door, a sudden prickling sensation crept up the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I hesitated before getting in, subtly glancing over my shoulder. The parking lot was mostly empty. A single car sat 2 rows down, dark and motionless. I couldn't see inside, its windows tinted just enough to obscure the interior. My stomach tightened. "Stop it," I told myself. "You're being paranoid." Still, my hands felt unsteady as I pulled the door shut behind me, locking it the moment I was inside. The quiet inside the car felt heavier than usual. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. 11:37 p.m. I took a deep breath, put my hands on the wheel, and started the engine. The sound broke the silence, momentarily grounding me. I pulled out of the parking lot, forcing my mind to focus on the road ahead. The streets were mostly empty, lined with closed storefronts, and the occasional dim porch light from nearby houses. The town had an eerie stillness at this hour, a kind of silence that made every little noise feel amplified. The rumble of my tires, the faint whoosh of the wind, the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. As I made my first turn, I caught a glimpse of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought nothing of it, just another car on the road, but then I turned again. And so did they. A slow trickle of unease crawled down my spine. I checked my mirror again. The car was still there, maintaining a steady distance. Not too close, not too far. I turned onto a side street, taking a route I didn't normally take, just to see. The car followed. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced through logical explanations. It could be a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. Maybe I was imagining things. But with every turn I took, they mirrored my movements exactly. I switched lanes. So did they. My heartbeat picked up, a steady thump against my ribs. I exhaled slowly, trying to think. If they were really following me, the worst thing I could do was lead them to my apartment. I needed to be sure. Up ahead, there was a gas station, a 24-hour one, still lit up with flickering neon signs. Without signaling, I made a sudden right turn into the parking lot and pulled up to one of the pumps. I didn't get out. Instead, I kept my hands on the wheel and watched. The car slowed down as it passed the entrance. For a moment, I thought, they might pull in after me. But then they continued driving, disappearing down the road. I let out a shaky breath, my chest tight with lingering anxiety. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I was just on edge because of what the cashier had said. Still, I waited a few more minutes before pulling back onto the road, my hands unsteady as I drove home. By the time I parked outside my apartment complex, the tension in my body hadn't fully eased. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, scanning my surroundings. The street was empty. No sign of the car. I told myself to relax, to breathe. But as I got out of my car and started toward my building, that same prickling sensation returned. Like I was being watched, like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, the keys clutched tightly in my hand. My apartment door had never felt so far away. The night was silent, thick with an eerie stillness that wrapped around my apartment like a suffocating blanket. At first, I thought I had imagined it. A sound, a faint rustling, almost too soft to notice, stirred me from the restless haze of sleep. My eyes snapped open, my body tense. The room was bathed in darkness save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. My heart pounded against my ribs, a deep throbbing drumbeat of unease. I turned my head toward the window. My breath caught in my throat. The soft crunch of gravel, the slow, deliberate steps. Someone was there. Outside. Swallowing hard, I pushed myself upright, careful not to make a sound. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the cold surface slick with sweat from my palm. I hesitated before unlocking the screen, afraid the light would give away that I was awake, that I was watching. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, sending a shiver down my spine. The steps had stopped. I turned my head toward the blinds, my breath shallow. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned forward, pressing my fingertips against the edge of the curtain, pulling it back just an inch. Just enough to see. A shadow stood beyond the streetlights, motionless, watching. A figure, tall and still, lingered at the edge of the pavement, just where the glow of the street lamp faded into darkness. I couldn't make out any features, just an outline, a silhouette that seemed impossibly still, as if frozen in time. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Was it a neighbor? A passerby? But who stood like that, unmoving, in the middle of the night? My mind raced back to the cashier's warning. You should be careful. Was this what he had meant? Had he known this would happen? Had he seen something, someone, before? I clenched my phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Call the police. That was the logical thing to do. But what would I tell them? That there was a shadow outside my window? That someone was just standing there? It wasn't a crime to stand on the street. But something about the way they stood, the way they watched, it felt wrong. Minutes passed, each one stretching unbearably long. My breathing was shallow, every muscle in my body locked in place. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, and then the figure took a step forward. My pulse spiked. Another step. The figure moved closer, just enough for the streetlight to touch the edge of their form. I caught a glimpse of something, a dark hood, the shape of a face obscured by shadows. Then, as if sensing my eyes on them, they stopped again. For a long, breathless moment, neither of us moved. And then, they turned. Without a sound, without hesitation, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing beyond the reach of the light. I stayed frozen, my breath ragged, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might shake the walls. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. Even then, I didn't sleep the rest of the night, because I knew deep down they would be back. The morning light did little to chase away the lingering unease from the previous night. Every shadow felt longer, every quiet moment stretched with anticipation. I barely slept, my mind replaying the image of the shadowy figure over and over, the memory of those footsteps outside my window. The way the figure had simply vanished, it all felt surreal. But what disturbed me most wasn't the figure. It was the cashier's warning. You should be careful. His voice echoed in my mind, low and urgent, filled with something more than concern, something close to fear. He had known something, and I needed to know what. I made my way to the convenience store, my heart pounding with every step. The sun was bright, casting golden streaks across the pavement, but it didn't ease my nerves. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the same car from the night before, creeping at a distance, but there was nothing. Just the morning traffic, people going about their lives as if nothing was wrong, as if I hadn't spent the night on the edge of terror. The store came into view. It looked the same as it had the night before. Dull fluorescent lights, the faint hum of a buzzing sign. I took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. A young woman stood behind the counter, counting change in the register. She barely glanced up as I walked in. I approached cautiously, my palms sweating. "Hey," I started, my voice dry. "I was here last night." She nodded absently. "Okay." There was a guy working the counter, middle-aged, kind of tired looking. "Do you know when he's coming back?" The woman's brow furrowed. "Who?" I swallowed. "The cashier. He was here around midnight. I spoke to him." She shook her head. "I don't know who you're talking about." My stomach twisted. "Maybe you weren't working the late shift, but he was here. He warned me about something." The woman gave me a puzzled look. "Sir, we close at 10. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I blinked, trying to process what she had just said. "No, that's not right," I insisted. "I was here around midnight. I remember the lights, the shelves, the smell of cleaning supplies. He rang me up." She frowned, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. "We close at 10, she repeated slowly. "No one was here at midnight." My breath quickened. I turned, scanning the store, as if some proof of last night's events would suddenly materialize before me. But everything looked normal, ordinary, except it wasn't. The man had been here. I had spoken to him. I remembered his voice, the way he hesitated before warning me. "You should be careful." But now it was as if he had never existed. I turned back to the woman. "Is there a security camera?" "I just need to check." She shook her head. "Sorry, but if you were here at midnight, it wasn't here." The chill that ran through me was deeper than fear. It was something else, something colder. I stumbled out of the store, my pulse hammering in my ears. The world around me felt distant, like I was moving through a dream. Had I imagined him? Had I hallucinated the entire conversation? No, that wasn't possible. I remembered his face, his tired eyes, the way he looked at me like he wanted to say more but couldn't. And then it hit me. What if he wasn't warning me about something? What if he was warning me about someone? I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. I had to check something. Pulling up the internet, I typed in the store's name, scrolling through old news articles, local reports, anything that could give me an answer, and then I found it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. Local convenience. Store clerk found dead in apparent robbery. Suspect never caught. The article was dated 2 years ago. The picture was grainy, but there was no mistaking him. The tired eyes, the lined face, the man who had warned me, a man who had been dead. For 2 years, I dropped my phone. The world around me spun, my vision swimming. My mind screamed at me to make sense of it, to find a logical explanation, but there was none. He had been there. I had spoken to him. He had tried to warn me, but he had never been there at all. A cold wind rushed past me, sending chills down my spine. And for the first time since last night, I didn't dare look over my shoulder. What do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments below.